So, Catherine, today we're going to talk about the power of storytelling.
We're really excited to be here. It's such a privilege. We're driven both by a passion and a desire to integrate storytelling into our own practice and share that with you in really practical ways. And that was one of our goals for today, is to kind of guide you through our story in terms of how we use storytelling and how we've seen others use storytelling Canada-wide, really.
Yeah,
Yeah. So.
we want to acknowledge that we're on Treaty 6 territory and the traditional gathering for many Indigenous people, and we honor and respect languages, ceremonies, culture, stories of First Nations, Métis, and Inuit who call here home.
We want to kick things off by introducing ourselves. And what we're going to do throughout the entire session is really play to both of art and images and storytelling in its broader forms. So we'd like to introduce ourselves through an image.
So, my image is here, lovely trees in the heart of BC. And this could be a story about a hike or the seduction of forest and the compulsion to walk faster without care and then getting lost and then getting found. But it's also a story about a renewed respect for folklore and stories that caution children about how they play on the forest edge. And it's probably a familiar archetypal story, but my background in literary studies makes me very biased about how stories matter in general, whether you're telling your children stories before bedtime or whether you're visiting your grandparents and you relish hearing about their stories. So I'd like also to draw attention to the stories in the modern human world, the stories they tell and they tell to each other. That stories are not only for humans, but all beings are story beings, and the very nature of the passage of time and being are storied. But that's for another chapter. Catherine, your story.
My story is less complex. This is my dog. His name's Vigo. He's named after Viggo Mortensen, who is a poet, a playwright, and owns his own publishing company. And the interesting story about my dog is at the height of COVID, not this dog, but we have another dog, escaped out of our back gate and got pregnant by a golden doodle. And Vigo, this gentleman that you see here on the screen, was one of 8 puppies that we had at the height of COVID. And during that time, we would have people lined up at our back gate to hold puppies. We heard stories of lost pets and pets they had lost and loneliness. And really, it became a point of connection. It's interesting. I shared this photo at another session we gave, and I shared this photo of Vigo, and one of the faculty members came up to me and said, I have the same dog, just slightly different fur. And so for me, stories are a point of connection. It kind of allows you a window into each other's worlds. And so, yeah, this is Vigo, and he has become the love of my life. So what we'd like you to do now, if for those who are willing and is to share a bit of your story. So in the chat, if you would be willing to select an image that you feel comfortable sharing and is meaningful to you and represents a part of your story. Or alternatively, if you don't feel comfortable doing that, if you could select an image of a story that you found powerful and impactful. It could be something you've watched on Netflix. It could be anything. Here I've got The Bear, which I got slightly obsessed with on Disney Plus. And for me, it was a really powerful story and gave insight into the inner world of their characters, which was complex and filled with turmoil. And so, as I know many people really enjoyed watching it. So if you could take some time to find an image, and if you can't find an image, even just one word or a sentence that represents a story that you find powerful, that would be great. And if you could share that in the chat.
So as you're selecting your story and you're being intentional about the image that you have chosen to share, we invite you to reflect on why do you select the story? Why do you choose? And what do you choose? And what do you omit? And how does that story, what power does it have over you? How does it compel you? And how is it in sharing sometimes a simple story or a simple image, it can compel others to be moved by that story?
It's interesting, and also the level of vulnerability that comes with sharing. It's interesting. Really grateful, and just want to express our gratitude for those people who are willing and have been vulnerable enough to share their images and their stories. It's interesting. Part of the reason I always start with my dog is dogs are really safe places to start with, and knowing that it allows other people to share stories in a way that's safe. So when we talk about sharing stories, it doesn't necessarily have to be the story to the extreme. And so sometimes starting out with the dog, it just provides a little avenue for other people to come in. So we'd love for you to, I know maybe potentially that you haven't had time to find an image, but please do share it to the chat. I love the kitties, and it's going to distract us through the entire presentation. Just defunct. So as we're presenting, if you find your image, feel free to throw it into the chat room. So yeah, we're very, very grateful for those who have chosen to share with us. So why are stories so powerful? And I think the images that we've just shared already express it. It captures the richness of life and the complexities of experience. And it gives us an opportunity to share not only about our lives, but also to connect with others and point of connection. For me, from a learning standpoint, I've always really advocated about the use of storytelling in education, because for me, the learners come with their rich and depth of stories through which the lens through which they view the world. And they make sense of the content that's being taught and their world through their stories. So, citing to Bruner, it gives us the structure in which we can kind of hang our experience and make sense of who we are. We're also very hardwired for story. There's that emotional connection. Our brains are stimulated in the same way as what it would be like. So in the sharing of, for example, the one, what is it? But trans kids, it evokes things within us. We can all relate to those images that Robert just shared in a way. So we can imagine what it's like to be at that protest right then and there. So yes, we are hardwired for connection, and we are hardwired for stories. So it's connection through shared experience, and then it allows us to make sense of our worlds.
And in making sense of our worlds, we know fundamentally stories have the capacity to provide us with insight that had not been planned, that had not been prepared, that had not been anticipated. There is that power to open spaces that we had not imagined. And when we are thinking of stories, because they're so powerful, we want to be intentional, because at the heart, at the core, the center of storytelling is intrigue, is emotional stirring that can rouse us from apathy or cognitive sleep. So with selection and omission, we have to be intentional and responsible, because we never know what can be triggered in the telling of a story, in the use of a story. Keep in mind, the stories that are not told also have power. So whether we choose to include or choose to omit, as an advocate for culturally relevant pedagogy, we keep in mind that students' stories are also part of their learning experience. And as educators, we have to be intentional and ethical in how we use storytelling, because it can be so powerful.
And you never know what it's going to evoke within your learners as well.
Yeah.
That's something that's like that unanticipated learning. You learn sometimes by hard knocks, and sometimes the sharing of stories can evoke certain things in certain people that you wouldn't have anticipated.
So if we want to put a framework for storytelling in the classroom, we know we can mine stories from instructors, from us as educators. We can pull from students' experiences, narrative teaching, narrative learning. We can also draw stories from beyond the walls of the academy, beyond the walls of the classroom. We can both imagined and real in the multiverse, in the literal verse. We can think of the untold and the hidden stories. If we also talk about the hidden curriculum, we want to think about those stories that sometimes go unseen but are just as powerful in our teaching.
And I think to our collective story, even just from watching the chat unfold, it's kind of a gift that you've been given us in terms of the willingness to share your images, because that has become this session's collective story through images. And that was our secret hope. So thank you. Thank you. The next section of our talk, we actually just want to spend the time going through worked examples of where we've seen storytelling and narratives play out with regards to the classroom. And we hope that you will get inspired by it, take it, run with it, adapt it to your own context. And it's really the rest of the presentation is mostly devoted to this. And yet we're still scratching the surface.
Yes.
I am always advocating for integrating stories into the curriculum and storytelling. And so really, we know that this is a limited representation in terms of the forms and shapes from, traditional oral telling to digital storytelling to then interviewing and research. That Nancy, that image has always impacted me, the migrant mother, always. And it speaks to images that go cross-culturally and can impact wide. So in the next section of our presentation, we just want to dive into a few of the stories and the forms of stories that we'll be exploring. Oh, there's a beautiful little boy. So going off the concept and the theme of storytelling through images, is the example of using data visualization when you're teaching. Data visualization is really powerful in terms of if you're having complex concepts that have a lot of data, to try to reduce it down and explain it in a way that's simple, quick, and easy for students to relate to. Many people find it easier to understand a visual representation rather than the numbers and the complexity of that. It allows you to share data. This image was produced, actually, my husband, ironically enough, he does communications for the Alberta government. And this was one of his data visualizations that he did with the Edmonton Food Bank. And so it's telling you the story of just in 2012, just how much food was donated, equaling 673 elephants. And so it's really clearly communicated. It's all the extraneous information has been taken away. And we know that using data visualization allows students to more easily identify patterns and outliers and trends in the data, and it improves data retention and engagement within students themselves. But it's interesting. I look at my husband's work and I think it's deceptively difficult to create compelling data visualizations. I'm always in awe of those people who can do data visualization well. And so really it aims to tell a story and in a simplified way. So another example is through animation. This is a beautiful story, and you can find it on YouTube. It's called Breaking Down Walls by Airbnb. And if you get a chance, watch it. It tells the story of the fall of the Berlin Wall. I think it was in 1987. And there's a guard, and he's moved away from Germany and has very tainted memories of Germany. And his daughter wants to bring him back. And so they book an Airbnb, and they open the Airbnb door to find the guard who was on the east side of the wall. And all of a sudden, that wall in his own mind, in his psychology, breaks down. And the story of that, as complex as that story is told in a minute and 16 seconds. And it's beautifully told through not only kind of the narration of it, but also through images, sound, art, and color. And so if you're teaching a concept that's really complex, you can search out animations, bring them into your classroom. For those students who are talented at doing animation, it is a way to tell their own story. And the power comes from the ability to control the narrative. You're able to really focus in on the characters and block out any kind of extraneous information that might confuse. And so you have the power to control the narrative. And then also the power to integrate symbols and color to really drive those messages home, and the ability to connect to characters through emotion.
And I mean, when we talk about Pixar and Disney, one of my colleagues, former colleagues, whose work is in animation, created a whole program of study just to remind students that this is not just a hobby. This is the real world. We're capturing stories about our reality.
We've got a request for the YouTube link for the wall. We'll post the link to the Airbnb in the chat.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, definitely.
I've already posted it for you.
Oh,
Thank
brilliant.
you.
Thank you, Graham. Look at that is such a brilliant. I love working with wonderful people. That is one of my favorite things in life.
And because we're talking about, we started with images, and I'm transitioning from the idea of digital storytelling and the use of traditional image storytelling, because there was a time that these forms of storytelling were not valued in certain homes and certain families. And I'm just remembering the story my colleague once said about how his father gave him a tough time for pursuing storytelling in the career in comic and graphic novels. But when we think about how graphic novels do facilitate the learning of difficult topics. If we think about spirituality in Neil Gaiman's work, if we think about racism, looking at the Truth Mina series graphic novels, if we think about Mouses exploring genocide and the Holocaust, these graphic novels, I mean, this is just a sample. If you have graphic novel reading as part of your hobby, you recognize that the difficult, complex topics that they deal with and they make accessible, they make manageable, they make more accessible emotionally, then we kind of, I wrote my master's thesis on Mao, such an important work and highly recommended. You know what? I also want to make up the reason I also wanted to talk about graphic novels is because the Academy is now recognizing graphic novels as ways to actually communicate dissertation and research content. And that's how I'm so energized and excited that we've recognized graphic novels as a legitimate form of storytelling that we are going to bring into the classroom. I also want to take us also back to the very beginning. Well, I don't want to say the beginnings, one of the earliest forms of storytelling in terms of ballads, and how we talk about images. Now we want to talk about music and the auditory, the body experience of storytelling. Oh, thank you. The whole idea that if you think about Tracy Chapman's work and her ballad about talking about a revolution, fast car. If you're not big on the Grammys, I invite you to have a look at Chapman's rendition with Luke Combs, the way he bringing that story back, that in the 80s, that this was a very powerful story. And in 2023, this is just as powerful as storytelling about the economy, sociology, family relations. My old man's got a problem, lives with a bottle. If you've grown up on Chapman, then you know how powerful song and song lyrics and dance and film can be tools in our classroom. So that even if you're teaching biology, or if you're teaching economics, or if you're teaching sociology, that using storytelling as a technique is also very, very powerful for students.
I love that she is truly a storytelling with her words and voice. You know, it's interesting because voice comes up quite prominently for me when we talk about storytelling. But yeah, it's funny how it also has the ability to transport you back to the 80s. You know, in this time period, how stories not only can join you but also transport you and give you a bit of an escape. Yeah. Now, and then there's the actual power of the student stories themselves. Prior to coming to work at MacEwan, I worked at the U of A for quite some time. The length of years will remain anonymous. But I worked on a program design, and it was an interdisciplinary program design, and it was with about 4 different faculties through phys ed, nutrition, medicine, and we brought the faculty together to join in designing a health and wellness program. And one of the activities that I really, really pushed for was the students to share their own stories of wellness. It was interesting at the time because, you know, there's certain risk that sometimes faculty associate with the sharing of stories and the vulnerability that come with that. And I really, in design of this program, I really stuck to my guns and said, no, this is going to be a really powerful kind of exercise for the students to go through, because there's one thing to learn the content, but really we all see through the content through a storied lens. And so they had the students create video diaries of their own health and wellness. And it shocked them in terms of what was actually shared. When they did this, they confided in me that they didn't realize, they expected to hear stories from young women in terms of their wellness story, in terms of nutrition and physical activity, but it was actually the stories of the young men at the U of A, the number of stories that came from the young men and their kind of journey through health and wellness that wasn't necessarily all that smooth, that surprised them. And it's just goes to show you that we can sometimes make assumptions. And when you have students share their stories, it's when you're taking those assumptions apart as an instructor. So we make assumptions that through learning about the stories of their students, and it also makes the content really relevant to the real world lives of those students. And that's why I'm such a proponent of that. Another project that I was really privileged to be upon, I was invited to do an advanced ed contract through Women Building Futures. And for those who aren't familiar with Women Building Futures, it's a nonprofit here in Edmonton, and they focus on retooling and reskilling women for the trades. And often these are students and women who have had historically not necessarily that positive experiences in school. They have often had issues with, drug and alcohol addiction issues. They've had experience of domestic violence. And so this nonprofit, their goal is to retool and rebuild the skills of women. And I was invited and hired by Women Building Futures to create a program that would teach staff members and instructors at Women Building Futures what it meant to work with these women in a way that was compassionate and empathetic. And so, and I'm going to just lead in with a little bit of a story. It was my first day on the job, and I was sitting next to a young student. And she turned to me and she said, I said, "Are you excited to be here?" And she said, "Yes, I am." And she said, I'm about 5 years ago, I was in a really bad relationship, and my boyfriend was addicted to drugs. He was, on cocaine and things like that. And I was addicted to drugs. And that was 5 years ago. I had no job and no prospects. And here I am 5 years later. I've got 2 kids. I'm enrolled in this program and I'm so excited because I'm clean. I'm beyond my addiction issues now. I've managed that part of it. I've got 2 kids. And she said, and I'm only 21. And it was in that moment that the design of the program kind of hit me in the face, because I realized, I thought, if only the people who are coming to work with the students understood their stories, understood their hopes and their dreams and the struggle and the dedication that it took to get to this point, and could walk in their shoes, then you build that empathy and compassion. So through that, we actually ended up filming, we actually produced I hired a videographer who I knew was brilliant at what he did, and I will give him as a recommendation to anyone who needs a videographer. And we filmed 45 instructor stories and student stories. So not only was it important for me to capture the student narratives from all various aspects and different students and representation, and Indigenous stories, because they serve 30% of their students are Indigenous, but also instructor stories, from the instructors working in the shops to the instructors who were guiding them in their day-to-day struggles. And so it was really about capturing kind of videos from all of them. And it was beautiful. The woman who led the program has, and it goes back to voice, she actually sang in a choir. And so when you watched her speak and you listened to her speak, she had this lyrical way of speaking. That one of the instructors who's on the screen, she was Indigenous. And so we really worked together, and she was teaching me what I would need to know in order to set Indigenous students coming into the program up for success and to be able to relate to their struggles and their actual triumph of being there. As a part of that program, we also developed case studies. So from that, we took the most common real world challenges that were facing these learners, and we turned them into case studies. I worked with a really talented multimedia expert, and we turned them into digital narratives. And so we wrote the case studies based on the expertise of the individual and our content expert. And then we turned them into digital narratives. We used photos and images and voiceovers. We hired voice actors. And so we after writing them, to hear them come alive through the kind of voice actors' tones, and we actually went through several voice actors to pick the right voice for that story. So it just, the power of it all coming together. And there are a lot of resources and support in terms of your students' ability to create their own digital narratives within their classroom. I know Berkeley does quite a bit of work in digital narratives, and it's a really powerful way for students to capture their own stories. I gave a session recently on creativity in the classroom, and I came across this individual, Dr. Dyer at Memorial University, and he was using storytelling in a whole different way. He had his students, so he was teaching history and folklore, and he was having his students participate in student-led research. So he had a fear of losing the oral history of the seniors in the northern community in Newfoundland. And so he sent his students up there to not only preserve the oral history, but to connect with the seniors. So stories became kind of a tool for social change and connection. And I thought that was such a beautiful kind of thing that you would, say there's a need to, you can see them sitting side by side and the sharing of their stories to validate their own stories, but also as just a point of connection and that they matter. I think in the story telling of stories, it's about letting people know that their story matters and that they matter and that they're seen.
And to emphasize the element of research, that's also part of why narrative inquiry became so big. Clandestine and Connolly, if any of you here do use narrative inquiry as research modes, the recognition that narrative as an epistemological framework is so valuable for how we move through the world, that making spaces for narrative inquiry in our classrooms as a research method and as a process, not just a product, but also a process, creating connection, is also very powerful.
And also there's the power of story to go beyond the classrooms and then to impact the community beyond. I know that there's an initiative here at MacEwan where they're getting students paired with the RCMP to tell RCMP stories. So it's looking at ways narratives can go beyond the walls of the classroom to then impact the community on an educational leadership level. And this is near and dear to my heart. This initiative was quite recent and it's still going on at MacEwan. It's a 3-part initiative. It's called the Interdisciplinary Dialogue Project. And there are 3 major events that MacEwan has hosted. One is with their Indigenous Center, and they centered the event around stories of perseverance. The second event was in line with Black History Month, and we did Black Stories of Belonging. And then the third event is actually occurring tonight in this evening, and it's with the Ukrainian Center, and it's stories of hope and rebirth through Mariupol and the war that's going on there. And there's been 3 separate events. Each event has explored and embraced storytelling in different ways. So the images that you're seeing on the screen are from the Black Stories of Belonging aligned with Black History Month. And we had everything from art. You'll see students doing art, creating their own stories. We had story circles where people were sharing their stories in a really protected way. There was music and dancing. Following each of these events, there's an online forum where we invited students to share their own story of belonging and share their own stories. There's guest speakers. With the Indigenous Center, they had artists come and share their story, and then afterwards everyone was invited to make zines. And I didn't realize, but zines are very low cost kind of magazines. And it's interesting because I sat on the organizing committee for these 3 events, and my constant message was, what do you want people to do with their own story? It's one thing to be told a story, but then how do they take their story and connect it to what's being told? So this was an interdisciplinary organization-wide events. And so it just speaks to the use of story beyond the classroom to then how do you drive it throughout your institution and the power that this has. this is an example of some of the art that came that represented the stories of belonging.
Cooking, puppies,
It was
relationships,
it was really
meditation, work.
it was really interesting. And in that kind of leading up to that event, I had led probably 3 story groups with students on coming together and doing their own art. And it was interesting to really connect with students as they did the art. It was less about the art and the product than it was about the process. And it gave them an in to ask each other about their stories. It was almost like, oh, that looks interesting. Can I find out more about your story? So yeah.
And it would be remiss if we did not include social media as in taking it back to oral traditions and oral storytelling and music and images, how social media has been a way of capturing all of these angles of storytelling. So that's what this was supposed to be about, even in the formatting, about how posts and reels become storied and less about sound bites. But I also thought it would be relevant to talk about how Indigenous storytellers have become more accessible through social media, and how, if we think about our actions towards truth and reconciliation, then exploring stories by and about Indigenous experience through the use of social media can be a strategy to support teaching and learning. So I can imagine I've heard instructors to say, well, social media might not be something I'm comfortable with. And then I say, well, what's the difficult content that you're trying to engage with, that you're trying to capture? Because our students are living on social media platforms, and being intentional in how you use it can be something that's worth thinking about. And I'm going to also take it back to traditional storytelling in terms of short stories, novels, poetry. These modes have become more accessible through social media. I would not teach literary studies again without using social media, because that's the way we enter into those dialogic relations with the authors, with others, even beyond the actual classroom. Who else is talking and thinking about this? And if you go on TikTok, you will have book talk, and so that you have a wider community to engage with those challenging topics.
Strange when I think about social media, as well as I think about how curated our stories have become, and generationally that presents a lot of challenges in some respects in terms of how do we curate our stories. And the students who are coming to our classroom, they also have, if you don't feel comfortable selecting stories, they have a breadth of experience of bringing the stories, just as we did with the images at the start, of presenting stories within the class and having a dialogue around those stories.
Yeah. And we want to keep in mind that stories are not neutral. They're connected to emotions. And so when we think about using storytelling in the classroom, we also always want to be aware that they can open up spaces that are uncomfortable. And so we want to be very intentional in how the questions we raise around stories and the spaces they lead us to.
So stories with an impact, as I have an instructional design background, so I'm always looking at how can we use stories within the classroom to support specified learning outcomes, and how can we use stories in a way that makes the content relevant, so the learning becomes internalized to the students, and that really they go home with it. It hits home. It becomes memorable. We talk about deep and meaningful learning, and stories are a way to do it. Stories, for me, they need to demonstrate the complexities and intersectionalities of the life. They provide an inroad to be able to do that. And they also, powerful stories allow us to suspend imagination. Whether they are real or not, they allow us to connect, but they also allow us to escape. So that's something. And they're communicated with impact. It's not just the story itself, but the way in which it's communicated. And they're emotionally compelling.
So we always, in our roles as educational developers, we always take it back to what's the learning objective? What's the instructional objective? What is the difficult content or the difficult learning all the imaginative learning or the optimistic learning, the radical optimism that you're hoping to infuse in your learning, is there a place for it in your classroom? And what do you hope your students are going to offer? What are you hoping to offer? This is not necessarily, we are opening the floor now for discussion, for thoughts, for inspiration. We also want to draw from what you have to offer. And
any questions you might have or ideas about how you use storytelling within your own classroom. And so we'll just open up to the chat. Or any questions that you have for us.
Yeah. Go back to the pictures.
Mandy has talked about the Digital Scholarship Center offers tools, training, support as well at the U of A community. Thank you, Mandy, for that.
Thanks.
You know, it's interesting. I just did a session recently on alternative forms of assessment, and at MacEwan we have podcasting studios. This is something that's another form of storytelling.
Oh, right. And this is kind of our recap slide. And just to sum up, that we've captured some types of stories. If we had to list all the types of stories there, then this would be way too cluttered. But we wanted to take it back to the oral component. And when I think of the rise of podcasts in the last 5 to 10 years, I feel as if it's kind of gone back to that. It's a recognition that stories being told, whether it's written or oral, but the fact that stories, when you in the performing of a story, its power is undeniable. And when we think of coming from ballads and epics and folk tales all the way to how digital storytelling in the last 20 years has taken up, then we come all the way back to reels and podcasts in the digital space.
Allie's just commenting. She said, I teach social work with families class. We do digital story sign relates to stories. It's always amazing how students create the most beautiful and moving stories. They educate, inspire, and create empathy. I always think our students are actually such a vast resource of just creativity in terms of their ability to teach one another. And I think that really speaks to that. Storytelling is crucial to my methodology as a teaching tool, as a means to learn, and a way to into another's stories through character, empathy, and reflection. Reflection is a critical thing, I think, as well. So we've talked about the telling of the story, but having kind of a structured reflection around that is really, really important.
And I think it was Dyer who said, we know that we expected that some people in the room would already be, so we thank you for those tips. Robert asked, how do you evaluate the story?
That for me, it's interesting. I just did a session on alternative assessment strategies. For me, that comes back to the learning outcomes.
Yeah.
And it's really ultimately what is it that you're assessing them on in terms of the critical need to know content? Is it their ability to answer certain stories or their ability to think in a certain way, whether that be discipline specific? And so it really comes back to what it is you're assessing related to your learning outcomes, and what way are you using the story to communicate that in that context?
It also takes us back to process and product. Story is also process, because I say you're story beings. When I say beings both animate and inanimate, everything is storied. And so it's a question of, is it the process or the product that you are interested in meeting for your instructional objectives? Recommendations around the length of time?
It just depends. For me, the video, if we're talking video, it can go anywhere from 2 minutes to, I wouldn't go anything longer than 10 to 15. So, it just depends on how it's being used, if it's being used online. Really, less is sometimes better. I want to just note that for questions, if there are questions that you have, you can always contact us and we'd be happy to chat. So I have some solid ideas around assessment, but it's not time limited within this context. So please do contact us. I ask myself, even for an icebreaker, what is your purpose in soliciting or evoking stories? It's interesting. The icebreaker that we used at the start of this session is an icebreaker that I use often within my own sessions. And I use it for a couple of reasons. I use it because it allows students to connect with each other. It allows staff to connect with each other. And for me, I need to create a space where vulnerability is okay.
Yes.
And so sharing of stories for me creates points of connection, but it's also setting a tone for the rest of the class, saying it's okay to be vulnerable and it's a protected, safe space.
The emotional connection. Yes.
Yeah.
Rosette is still not a camera, that's a sign.
Sorry.
If you don't mind sharing the larger screen, Galicia, so we can see everyone,
Oh,
or unsharing your slides. Thank you so much. We have come to the end of our formal time, so I would like to thank you for coming together with your instructional colleagues from across Alberta's post-secondary institutions. Thank you so much for having lunch with Edna. Please join me in thanking Galicia and Catherine for their offering their time and for their great ideas.